Assalamu alaikum everyone, hope you're all doing good. My name is Adnan Al Barakat, and in today's presentation for Rihal Talks, I'll be asking you what seems like a very simple question: who are you? So I'd like to ask if there are any volunteers who might want to answer that question. Muhammad? Okay. Anyone else? It's a very simple question. Who are you? Amjad?
I have an answer, but I remember Mutanabi
Okay, say it.
boy.
Say it.
It describes who he is. أنا الذي نظر الأعمى إلى أدب وأسمعت كلماتي وجدتها. So he is like an answer who he is.
That's actually a very good answer because it seems like it's a very simple question. You're just, for example, let's say you're at a job interview and one of the first questions that the interviewee asks you is, tell us about yourself. Who are you? And usually what goes on in our heads is that I'm going to talk about my educational background. I'm going to be addressing my previous work experiences. But then there's also this side of us that always is wondering, how far should I go? Like, how deep should I really answer that question? Do I talk about my hobbies? Do I talk about who I am as a person, my relationship with my friends and families, and so on? So this is what we will be discovering in today's Rihal Talks. It's a simple question, who are you? But then the answer to it has so many different layers and dimensions to who we are. Before I move on to the next slide, I just want to ask you guys, is anyone here interested in art and any kind of art? No, just a simple interest. You enjoy seeing it, analyzing it, whatever it is. Okay, nice. So, art and identity is something that goes hand in hand together. I have 3 paintings here by very famous artists over the history. Obviously, this is Vincent van Gogh. That is Gustave Courbet, and that one is Frida Kahlo. Now, when you look at these paintings, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Portraits, okay. What else? Dark, okay, very good.
Can you repeat the question?
When you look at these paintings, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? They all seem angry. Okay, those are all correct answers. There are no wrong answers today. Let me start with Vincent van Gogh. So this is a self-portrait of him with a bandaged ear. Now, the story behind it is actually very interesting. It was during a time where Vincent was living with an artist who was much more seasoned and experienced than he is. And they fell into this quarrel, a fight, an argument, and it got so heated and aggressive to the point that Vincent decided to cut off his ears. And then he gave it to someone random on the street. Now, the reason, I know it seems very dark, I saw everyone's reactions, but the reason that he did that is actually because Vincent used to suffer, from a lot of mental illnesses, mainly being bipolar personality disorder. However, the reason why he depicted himself in this sort of painting was because at that time he identified himself as a man with a bandaged ear. Obviously, if you cut off your ear, you're not just going to leave it for a couple of days and that's it. So for a very long time, Vincent identified himself as someone who was going through a struggle, and the only way that he represented that struggle was by cutting off his ear. And then this painting was created as a result of that. The second painting, as you can see from the title, it's literally called The Desperate Man. Gustave Courbet is a Spanish artist, I believe, and during his early 20s, he moved to France to pursue his art there, because at the time, France was very famous for its, art, and as I'm sure you know, the Louvre and all of that. Now, when he first moved to France, it was a completely different culture than the one he was accustomed to. And most of the artists had already, identified what sort of art are they doing. Some of them were doing expressionism, abstract, realism, whatever it is. But he was still trying to figure himself out. He struggled so much to the point that he felt desperate. And you can see that from the painting that he made of himself. This is a self-portrait. His eyes are bulged out. He's holding his hair angrily. There's some sort of pain that resonates through the painting. And so during that time, he identified as a desperate man. The last painting is self-portrait of Frida Kahlo with a thorned necklace and a hummingbird. Now, if you ever heard about Frida's life story, it's a very tragic and sad and desperate one. When she painted this painting, it was after she fell into a really bad accident that left her paralyzed from the waist down. After some time, her husband left her, they divorced, and she was in a really bad mental state. Now, there's so many elements that represent characteristics or traits of Frida herself. The thorned necklace is a depiction of Jesus Christ's resurrection. He came back from the dead. And so she depicts herself as someone who went through all of this trouble and all of this harsh life experiences, and she brought herself back from the dead, quote unquote. And so here she represents herself as someone who was resurrected and as someone who came, or a better sentence would be, rising like a phoenix from the ashes. The reason why I started off with art is because art and identity intersect to create something that is known as discovery of inner self. A lot of artists, if you notice, they have a lot of portraits. And for example, Gustav is actually one of the artists who had many, many portraits over the years. And it was represented in so many different periods of his life. There's portraits of him being happy, there's portraits of him being sad and depressed. Whatever emotion he identified with at the time, he put that on a painting. Now, art is often used as a tool to express ourselves, whether it was emotions, struggles, hardships, good times, bad times, whatever it is. It's always been an excellent medium to use to express something that is within. And so that is why we notice that a lot of artists actually, whenever they paint something, they always ask the viewer, what is it that you feel when you look at this painting? And therefore, art is one of the most important ways that can lead to inner self-discovery. Now that we have a basic general idea about art and identity, let's look at identity and its psychological aspects. When I asked you the first question, who are you? Muhammad answered, my name is Muhammad. When Amjad answered, he brought in a quote from Al-Mutanabbi, أنا الذي نظر الأعمى إلى أدبي وأسمعت كلماتي من به قد صمموا. Now, do you see the difference between the two answers? Muhammad answered by his name. My name is Muhammad, and that is a fact. But let's dissect a little. I wasn't planning on actually doing this, but because he brought it up, I think it's an interesting point to talk about. Let's dissect the poem that Al-Mutanabbi wrote. أنا الذي نظر الأعمى إلى أدبي. For those of you who don't speak English, it essentially translates to, I am the one who the blind sees my poem, let's just say it that way. وأسمعت كلماتي من به قد صمموا. And the one who cannot hear has heard my words. In this poem, did he ever refer to himself as a person? No. What was he referring to? He was referring to his ability to write poems. الشعر, كتابة الشعر. And so what's interesting about that is why basically identity is interesting, is because oftentimes when we're asked, who are you? The first thing that comes to our mind is, my name is Adnan, I'm this years old, and this is what I do for a living, and so on and so forth. But what about that veil that is behind? What about your inner self? What about who you truly, really are? And that is a really great example that Amjad gave us. Al-Mutanabbi was not referring to himself as a person, but rather what his craft is. And he knows he's an excellent writer, because who would go on to say, I am the one that the blind can read my poems? So the psychological aspects of identity mainly are four. It's memories, experiences, relationships, and values. Now, memories essentially influence present actions. For example, let's say that, you know, I'm sure you all know about the inner child and trauma and all of that. It's a very interesting topic. Oftentimes what happens is that when you experience something as a child, you develop a sense of feeling towards that thing. And what happens is that when you grow older, if something triggers that feeling, you find yourself repeating the same action over and over again. So this is why memories are actually one of the main factors that develop who we are as people. Experiences, basically decisions can be made based on how we reacted to previous situations or previous events or whatever it is. Again, as human beings, we're constantly evolving, we're constantly changing. It's a never-ending cycle. And so whatever we experience can actually influence the way that we make decisions in our future life or present self. The same thing with relationships. It's a bit of a personal question, but how many of you here are married? Okay, so it's, I think, most of you. I'll ask you a very simple question. Did you get to know yourself better after you were married? Or did you find yourself picking up habit from your husband or your wife? كل حد سكت. It's a simple question. يعني, did you find yourself picking up habits after them? Yes. So one of the main factors as well is relationships. Relationships, because you get to spend so much time with that one person, they start to rub off on you. So they might influence the way that you think, they might influence the way that you believe in different things, they might even influence the way that you behave. And that is why mostly the consistent relationship that we have growing up, or as humans in general, is our parents. You know, they bring us into this world, they raise us for God knows how many years, all the struggles, if you're a good kid, you're a bad kid, whatever it is. It's always relationships that can develop that sense of self. Lastly, but not the least, is values. What we believe in is what we experience. And this can go on to any dimension that you want, whether it was religious, cultural, personal, whatever it is. What you believe is what you experience. If you believe that, you know, everything in life is good, then everything you will experience will most probably be good. It's a form of manifestation, for example. And so all of these combining factors translate into what makes us who we are. The things that we experience, the people that we share a relationship with, the values that we have, and the memories that we collect as we grow older. Now, why do we care about identity? Forget the quote for a minute. I want you guys to answer the question. Why do you care about your identity? Or why do you think identity is something that we should care about?
It impacts how others see us, I think, or how others treat us. So it's important that we understand our identity.
Okay, that's a good answer. Anyone else?
Defines the way you go on about your life.
Okay. Okay. So we care about identity as human beings is because it creates a sense of belongingness. For example, the answer that Muna gave is that when we know ourselves, we expect people to treat us a certain way, right? And so that creates a sense of belongingness in the sense that when you know who you are and the layers that are within you, like an onion, basically humans are like an onion. There's so many different layers to us. When you get to know that, you start to build relationships with people that understand who you are as a person. Yani if you notice, for example, let's take a normal household. Let's say there's 2 parents and 4 different kids. Do you really think that every single kid or child will be the same? Mustahil, there's no way that happens. It's because each of them develops their identity in a separate way. Each of them belong to a different group of people. So this quote is from a psychiatrist, Asfiya Qadir, which basically says, we all have layers and dimensions that contribute to who we are and how we express our identity. If we find people that share the similar values and have same layers and dimensions to who we are, we're most likely to bond with them easier. And then that in itself can develop your identity as a person. Another reason, or a bunch of other reasons that we care about identity is because it creates self-awareness. Our identity is essentially the image that we present to everyone around us. Who am I? Where was I born? What is my background? Whatever it is, it's the image that we create for ourselves so that others can see us. Others can basically receive us in the way that we want them to. So it creates self-awareness. It makes you know who you really are. What do you want in life? Well, I think one of the most complex questions that we're often asked is, where do you see yourself in the next 5 years? Someone could say, well, I have a plan, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I want to achieve. But then do you really know what life has in store for you? You never know that. But having self-awareness is a tool that can help you identify, at least for the near future, what do you want to achieve? Because you know yourself, you know that in case some sort of experiences happen to you in life, you can find the way through it or out of it. Another thing is that it enables healthier relationships. Have you ever been in a situation where you start to be friends with someone, but the more you get to know them, the more you start to realize this person is not really for me. Our beliefs, they don't align. The way that we see life, it doesn't align. I see some people smiling, so I'm sure you all experienced that. When you know yourself, you're able to pick people and build relationships with them that are healthy. Some people might go into astrology for compatibility. Some people might go into what kind of books do you enjoy reading, but identity in itself, it helps us choose the right people for us to grow with. Then we have a sense of direction and motivation. Very similarly to self-awareness, is that when you're able to identify who you are as a person, that provides you with a sense of direction. So that means basically you know where you want to be and you know how to get there. You know that, well, in the future, I want to be this sort of person. In the future, I want to have this particular job. In the future, I want to raise a family, whatever it is. It provides a sense of direction like nothing else, as long as you are able to know who you are as a person and identify yourself. Lastly is that it keeps you grounded. In my experience, I've noticed that people who are very familiar with who they are as people, they're very grounded, they're very humble. Nothing can shake them. Yani the whole earth can be on fire, but they will not lift a single finger. It's because they know who they are. The worst thing can happen to them and they'll still be the same people no matter what. It keeps you grounded. It provides stability into your life as a person. The more you know yourself, the more you're able to control what affects you and what doesn't. Now let's look at different ways to reflect on your identity. The first thing is art. Just like we discussed in the beginning of the presentation, art is used as a medium to express what's within. So maybe you're interested in abstract art, I think is one of the ways that you can, just take paints and throw it and just يعني بالعربي طلع اللي في فؤادكم and just let it happen. What's the worst thing that can happen? It's going to be maybe an ugly painting, but it's a really good way to discover how you're feeling on the inside. Then you have reading, whether it was fiction, whether it was self-help books, whatever it is. Reading, especially when there's characters involved in the book, it helps you identify and relate to the characters. For example, if you've ever read, I don't know, whatever book it is, and there's a character that you feel like you relate to it, you feel like you two are the same person, that can actually help you identify who you are as a person. Maybe there's certain traits about yourself that you don't like and you want to change. Maybe there's certain things about that character that you resonate with. So reading can be a really great example to just tap into and try to figure out who you are. And obviously, the more knowledgeable you are, the more ability you have to communicate within yourself and to be able to identify what your identity is. Then we have nature. Okay, so we were made from dust and we will return to dust. Essentially, we're one with nature, and nature is one with us. You can go on hikes, you can go sit down on the beach, you can, take a nature retreat or whatever you want to call it. But having that connection with the earth itself that we were made from can really ground you and give you the ability to introspect and reflect on who you are. And then, as I mentioned earlier, relationships. Because usually what happens in a relationship is that the other person will be able to identify things about you that you're not aware yourself. Whether it was, I don't know, maybe someone lies and they don't realize that they lie. And in a relationship, the other person or the other significant can be like, okay, you know what, this is actually not true. That's not what you said. This is what you said. And quarrels can happen in discussions and arguments, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, you'll be able to know who you are as a person. And that is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Sorry for the hassle. It's a short question. Who are you?
So Ali basically asked me who I am. And honestly speaking, I don't know yet. Because I think as people, we are constantly evolving and changing. We go through a bunch of things in life that change our perspective. And to this day, I will not be able to answer that question if we're talking about it from what I just basically presented. So I still don't know who I am. I'm figuring it out.
Okay, so my question is a bit fundamental. First of all, thank you for the great presentation. My question is basically, when it comes to self-identification, for example, to understanding our personality and who we are, that's quite straightforward to me, I would say. My question here lies in how our identity is perceived by others. What do you think is when, let's say, everybody have a specific self-identification, how important that to ensure that everybody perceives that specific identification? For example, as you mentioned, some people will identify themselves in terms of their education. For example, I am a doctor, and everybody should perceive me as a doctor. Do you think it's fair that we should enforce this identification on everybody else? Okay, myself, I identify at that, but should I also ensure that everybody needs to know that I am a doctor? Is this part of the identity process here?
No. No worries, okay. So Tariq was basically asking that he thinks that finding or the journey of self-identification is very straightforward, correct me if I'm wrong, and that what you identify as does not necessarily have to be perceived by everyone as what you want them to perceive it as, correct? So personally, I think this is a very tricky question because as human beings, we all want to be seen the way that we represent ourselves. But then that doesn't mean that everyone will see us that way. This question has a lot of different dimensions and layers to it. However, personally, I will say, the way that you identify yourself is how you identify yourself. It's for you. Yani, for example, let's say that like the example that Tariq gave is that I'm a doctor. Now, you can go ahead and say you present yourself as مثلا Dr. Tariq. Now, when you think about it, those are just more يعني titles. And you can identify yourself as that, but the purpose of this presentation is more about what's within. Now, if you present yourself as a doctor, does that mean that I have to treat you as a doctor? Yani, I know that in society, like doctors and engineers and lawyers have like a very high respect, for example. But titles and the way titles are used don't necessarily align with who you are as a person. Like there can be a doctor, you can be a doctor, you can spend 7, 8, 10 years studying medicine or whatever it is, but then deep down you're actually not a good person. And doctors are supposed to be, the ones who preserve life and whatever the oath is. But to address the question again, how other people perceive you is how you present yourself. If you are presenting yourself in a particular way, then they will perceive you as that. If they don't perceive you the way that you represent yourself, it's not on either of you. I think people are entitled to see others how they want to, and it's just that as long as you know what you're representing, then you should be okay with it.
Can human develop more than one identity?
Yes, they can.
And is it considered a mental illness? Because in some cases are
Majid was asking if people can develop multiple identities. And the short answer to it is yes, they can. And there's two different aspects to it. There's the one that has more to do with the mental health of a person. For example, there's a lot of personality disorders. I don't know if any of you has seen the movie Split. So that is one person, like physically, but there's so many different identities that live within that person. And then there's this other thing called code switching. I don't know if you've heard of it before. Basically, I wouldn't say it's creating an entirely different identity, but rather how you make others perceive you. So code switching is, let's say that you're used to speaking in a certain way, but then when you're in a room with people and you perceive how these people are and who they are, you switch the way that you behave and the way that you talk. And so people could perceive that as your identity. Well, this is a very social person. He's an excellent speaker, blah, 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 blah. But then in reality, you're the complete opposite. But I personally consider it a skill, code switching. So sometimes it might be considered as like you're building different identities for different situations. Any other questions? Adnan?
Thanks, Adnan, for the actually an eye-opening presentation. So it's not actually a question, but rather maybe an input as well. Maybe also in relation to what Tariq have said as well. In Islam, we have a couple of, I would say, rules that might shape us or shape our identity. And so I guess you don't have the full right to develop your own identity, but rather sometimes external factors determine what is your identity as well. For example, we have this hadith of men having beard and we need to shave, for example, part of our mustache and so on. And we have a couple of other, for example. And so this shapes our identity. And I guess maybe the question would be, what do you think about that? External effects that helps in shaping your identity.
So external factors definitely do influence our identity. For example, just as I mentioned, experiences. You're not going to inflict experiences on yourself. Usually that happens as a result of an external factor being introduced into your life. And the same with, for example, relationships. You're not forcing these people to influence you. It's just something that happens naturally, out of your control. And so external factors definitely do have an influence. But if someone is, let's say, has enough self-awareness, they'll be able to identify that this particular factor is influencing them. And so then they can decide if they want that influence to continue or they can stop it, whatever it is, and then they can continue developing basically away from it, or rather developing themselves without letting that particular factor influence them. But factors definitely, I mean, for example, I don't remember what the quote is exactly, but it's something about when you're in an environment, usually that environment will affect you. But once you're out of it and you explore different environments, you learn different things from it. The same thing, just like cultural shock, for example. You know, you're used and accustomed to a particular culture, and as soon as you leave into a culture that is the complete opposite, things might affect you. Those are external factors. You might accept it, you might not accept it. It just depends on how you build your character as a person.
But my question is, are you allowed to accept anything? Do you have boundaries in shaping your identity?
That in itself is basically like, for example, okay. So for example, some people, I don't know how to say it in English, بس يعني أي شيء يصير في الدنيا يخلوه يعني يأثر عليهم. So whatever happens in their life, they just let it affect them. بالضبط مع الخيل يا شقرة. Okay, let me just try to rephrase this. مع الخيل يا شقرة essentially means إنه يعني whatever they do as they walk to their journey in life, they just let it influence them. But the good thing about having an identity is that you can build boundaries. So you know what sort of things can affect you and what sort of things might not affect you. So it's not a question of whether you're allowed to let it or not. It's a question of whether you can or can't. For example, the example that you mentioned, that Islam in certain ways can shape our identity. اللي هي في أشياء مسلمات وفي أشياء يعني لا. The things that are necessary for you to have, that's something that you can't لا أنا ما أريد. You know? So it just depends on what the situation is, and it depends on your ability whether you can limit it from affecting you or not. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Basically, what you are doing when you are saying I identify as something, you are casting a judgment on yourself. So that judgment maybe can be wrong upon yourself. Maybe you are taking it from a purely logical perspective or a theoretical perspective, from your high expectation maybe, or from a realistic perspective when the society you are living in. So my question is, do you agree that this process of identifying yourself can go wrong, for example? What I mean, can you identify yourself wrongly, not the way you think you are identifying?
So to answer the question, I don't think you can identify yourself wrongly, personally, because usually what happens is that when you reach to that level of identification, it's because you went through, for example, if it's because you went through a number of experiences that led you to that final decision, let's just say. And then I'm going to circle back to what I said earlier, is because as humans, we're constantly developing, we're constantly evolving, we're constantly changing. So if at a certain point in life you identified yourself as something, in the next 5-10 years, you might change that sort of identity. So I wouldn't necessarily say that you can identify yourself in a wrong manner, but it might not be the final version of yourself, for example. Yani everything goes through trials and tribulations. And until you get to that point, you're bound to make mistakes, you're bound to identify yourself wrongly, quote unquote. Oh my God. Okay. Okay, so Rahma Adam is asking, what do you think of people who are hypocrites and show you the good side while they are actually not? Do you think they have identity disorder? I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, so I don't see how I can answer this question, but hypocrites exist in our life in every single day. Every single day we face hypocrites, but maybe I wouldn't say that they necessarily have an identity disorder, because that would have to be clinically evaluated. But I think it's more of a choice. Like, if you want to be a good person, for example, you have the choice to be a good person. There's so much information available that can guide you to that decision. And the same thing if you want to be a bad person. You can let things influence you, for example, and lead you to being a bad person. With hypocrites, it's never either or. It's always in the middle. If I want something out of you, then I'll show you the face that you want to see from me. But if not, then I'll either show you who I really am, assume person, or I'll just, present myself to you in a way that pushes you away from me. So I don't know if it's an identity disorder, but there's definitely some underlying issues.
It's an identity, actually.
It is an identity.
Things done for themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. So thank you so much for attending, and thank you for